Hello and welcome to The Serrated Edge, an Australasian Humour Studies Network podcast where we speak with early career researchers and graduate students working in humour studies. A companion to the Cutting Edge podcast, the format is simple. Guests have 15 minutes to answer 5 questions about their research. It's short and sharp, so let's get on with it. My name is Till Knowles and I'm a PhD student at Monash University looking at live performance comedy and suicide jokes. And today I'm joined by Dr. Kyle Harvey. Kyle is a research fellow at Monash University whose work explores culture, media and social change in Australia and the United States. He's published widely on television history, migration, social movements and radical thought. Kyle is the co-author of Migrants, Television and Australian Stories, A New History, published this year by Routledge, and author of American Anti-Nuclear Activism, 1975 to 1990, The Challenge of Peace. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks, Till.
So, to start off, what are 3 keywords that summarise your research?
My first keyword is stories. I know it's pretty easy for a historian to say that they're interested in stories, but in that sense, I'm interested in exploring unexpected stories from the past. I like stories that challenge our assumptions about the past, about history, and about how we remember the past. And I'm really interested in what we might call lost or forgotten stories, things that aren't present in popular memory about what's happened in the past, especially the recent past, the latter half of the 20th century and into the present. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
My second keyword is people. I'm really interested in what people did in the past, how they interacted, what they thought, and how they went about doing what they did. And this is not just about comedy, but in various other aspects of history that I've explored in my research. But from there, we can start to look at bigger processes of historical change based on the stories of the people that I research. And I'll talk about this more in a bit. My third keyword is diversity. I'm really interested in diverse stories of people in the past, not just about cultural and linguistic and racial or ethnic diversity, but stories about people who've really challenged the power imbalances and how they've affected our understanding and memory of the past. Especially since the 70s, a lot of historians have been doing this, especially, and we call it the cultural turn in history, but I try to carry on that tradition in my research.
Excellent. They're 3 quite provocative and universal keywords in some ways. So I'm interested to know, why humour?
Well, I came to media and performance studies in a bit of a roundabout way. I did my PhD at Macquarie University in social movement history, and I looked at the anti-nuclear movement in the United States, which ended up becoming my first book, which was published in 2014. After I finished the doctorate, I was working as a research assistant on a media history project at Macquarie with Bridget Griffin-Foley, who's a historian of print media and radio. And we produced what came out as the companion to the Australian media, which is a really big compendium of short and long essays about Australian media history, personalities, radio stations, broader themes in media history in Australia, going right up to the present. It's a very, very large, complex volume. So that came out in 2015. And after a bit of time off, I started working at Melbourne University on a project about migration and television and cultural diversity in Australia. So part of that project looked at comedies because they're such a pretty enduring, popular genre of television in Australia, and they have been since television started in the 50s. And through looking at the intersections of migration and television in Australia, I came across plenty of migrants who were comedians or wrote comedies or acted in comedies or directed or produced comedies for Australian television. And my colleagues and I also found that when we were interviewing migrants about their experiences of watching television, they weren't necessarily migrants who worked in the industry, comedy was an enduring popular genre in television. So that's how I got into comedy and humour studies in the first place, because not just because it's an enduring popular genre in Australian media, but I think all of my research has come together in this roundabout way to explore comedy and its place in Australian life through the intersection of these numerous interests and numerous fields of research that I have.
Yeah, that's so cool. You've just slowly gravitated towards this very specific area that happens to reflect a lot of your other interests, like including, I assume, like radical politics and things like that, and comedy's use in that. You've described yourself as a historian. Can you talk a little bit more about your research methods?
So a lot of it's archival based, and that's the way I started doing historical research in my PhD. But I guess the way I started looking outside of the archive was to look at biography, because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in people's stories. So when I found an interesting character in the archive, I would look deeper and deeper into who they were and who they interacted with and what they did. So especially if it's someone who's not alive anymore, the historian really needs to use all the tools at their disposal to figure out who this person is and what they did and where they went and where they lived and so on and so on. But for people who are alive, and this is especially useful in the book about television and migrants, I used a lot of oral histories, and I did so in my PhD when I was looking at activists as well. Sitting down with someone over half an hour to 3 hours and hearing about their life, I think, is a really interesting way, not just exploring a person's biography. I use that term quite loosely, but also delving into what they remember about their youth or their adulthood, what they remember about various times and activities that they did in the past. But also, it's really interesting to unpack how people's memories affect what they understand of the past. And we can use their memories to analyze the past in that way.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and really interesting when considered alongside humour and comedy as well. What's something that you wish you'd known at the start of your career?
I wish I'd known a bit more about how to do archival research more broadly. I jumped into the PhD pretty green. I didn't do a master's. I'd done a cultural history honours thesis where I just looked at movies as the texts, and I was very underprepared. So I wish I'd done archives from the start. But also I wish I'd had a better sense about doing oral histories, because I think it's been a pretty formative part of my research, not just during the PhD, but afterwards. I also wish I'd had a better sense about a career trajectory that involved postdoctoral fellowships and so on. I just dilly-dallied around after my doctorate and have had this unusual route to where I am now as a comedy studies research fellow, because I work in so many different fields, and I've taken part-time fixed-term contracts. I've ended up here, but not that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's meant that I have worked on histories of radical activists and television producers, and I'm trying to figure out a way in my thinking to treat them the same way, or to study them the same way, if that makes sense. But on the surface, they're very different worlds to inhabit.
Yeah. So it's more about the methodological similarities that you bring to each of your research areas rather than a kind of thematic research interest that's guided your career so far.
Exactly. Yeah.
So from that history perspective, how would you say that you've seen multicultural comedy in Australia change over the last 50 or 70 years?
This is a question that I kind of set myself when I started working at Monash as a research fellow on this ARC-funded project called Comedy Country. The Comedy Country project is more broadly asking about comedy and social change in Australia from the 40s or 50s to the present. And because I'd had this background in looking at migration and the television industry in Australia from the 50s to the present, I thought this was just a neat little sidestep into looking at comedy. And as I started doing it, I thought stand-up comedy is the best way to explore this, not necessarily looking back over all the TV comedies that I'd looked at in the previous project. But as I've started doing this research, I've really struggled to define what multicultural comedy or culturally diverse comedy or culturally and linguistically diverse comedy actually is. The non-Anglo diasporas in Australia are so diverse, as you'd expect, and they have changed significantly in the 21st century. And trying to look at comedians and figure out why they talk about what they talk about on stage is really, really difficult, because that's the nature of comedy, is joking. Not everyone is earnest on stage. Now, I also don't want to use the frame of quote unquote belonging or quote unquote inclusion here, because I think that's not terribly appropriate when we're looking at such a broad array of people who perform comedy, stand-up comedy in Australia, or even people who watch stand-up comedy in Australia who are from cultural diaspora, non-Anglo diasporas. Because let's say a comedian is fourth generation non-Anglo family. Are they really interested in talking about their cultural background in Australia, or do they joke about it in ways that are flippant and non-serious because it's not a part of their identity? Exploring those questions is what I'm trying to do, and yeah, I'm yet to come up with a really concrete way, a methodological way to do so. I also think I'm going to tack on a bit of a thing to my answer here is
please do, yeah.
That a lot of scholars, and I'm going to mention Aileen Morton Robinson here, talks about the myth of national belonging and identity, because every non-Indigenous person in Australia is a migrant in that sense. And everyone who is non-Indigenous in Australia is taking part in the ongoing dispossession of our First Nations peoples. So we need to think about migrants in that frame as well. I know there's probably a big danger in exoticizing the migrant, or in or erasing their nature as someone who's come to Australia and taken part in the cultural dispossession of Indigenous peoples. I don't want to minimise the struggles that non-Anglo migrant communities have faced in Australia. There's a very real history of racism and discrimination, which we can't gloss over, and that the problems with that are ongoing in Australian society. So what I want to do with my research in this project that will go for another few years is to look into the intricate stories of migrant comedians, or comedians from migrant backgrounds, non-Anglo backgrounds, to really figure out how they think about their nature as someone from a migrant diaspora or as an Australian, and what their identity means to them as they go about doing comedy. I think there's so much complex terrain to explore here.
Yeah.
And it's not just about speaking to migrant comedians, but looking at their agency within the cultural sector, like on the festival circuit, exploring screen funding, people who do web series, people who perform in theatre, who write, who do radio, television and film, because the comedy sector in the broad arts and cultural sector in Australia is incredibly broad and diverse. So looking at the comedian's place within that sector and all those questions about identity that they bring to it are part of what I'm interested in.
Yeah, excellent. I'm so excited for the findings of your research. I think it is an incredible contribution to the overall Comedy Country project. If people are interested in getting in touch, obviously you've got some books that they can read, but do you have any social media or ways that they could reach out?
I've tended to step away from Twitter in recent times,
Same,
as many
yep.
people have done, but I use Blue Sky. And yeah, I think as I start to publish from this research, there'll be bits and pieces around. So I've got a Monash University profile, and people can find me there.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Kyle.
Thanks, Till.